So I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number, I don't think this number is right, it's 1011 of the House of Commons Standing Committee.
111.
111, there we go. Pursuant to the order of reference referred to the committee on Wednesday, May 29th, 2024, and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, May 27th, 2024, the committee resumes its study of Bill C-70, an act respecting countering foreign intelligence. Before we begin, I would like to ask all members and other in-person participants to consult the cards on the table for guidelines to prevent audio feedback incidents. Please take care to note the following preventative measures in place to protect the health and safety of all participants, including the interpreters. Only use black approved earpiece. The former gray earpieces must no longer be used. Keep your earpiece away from all microphones at all times. When you're not using your earpiece, place it face down on the sticker placed on the table for this purpose. And thank you all for your cooperation. So today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. So I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of members and witnesses. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking, and a reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. So I now invite, oh, wait a minute, where's our witnesses? Here we go. Specific comments on C-70. I would like to remind members that amendments to Bill C-70 must be submitted to the clerk of the committee by 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Friday, June 7th, 2024. It is important for members to note that pursuant to the order adopted by the House on May 30th, the 4 p.m. deadline to submit amendments is firm. This means that any amendments submitted to the clerk after the deadline and any amendments moved from the floor during clause-by-clause consideration of the bill will not be considered by the committee. So I would now like to welcome our witnesses for today. With us, we have Mr. Thomas Junot, Associate Professor, Public and International Affairs, University of Ottawa. Mr. Dan Stanton, former Manager, Canadian Security Intelligence Service. And by video conference, we have Mr. Benjamin Fung, Professor and Canada Research Chair, McGill University, and Javad Soleimani, Director, Association of Families of Flight PS 752 victims, and also by video conference. So welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us today. Your interventions will be most helpful to us, I'm certain. I now invite Mr. Junot to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes. Please go ahead, sir.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. So today I will be analyzing Bill C-70 through the lens of transparency. For 3 years, I was the chair of the National Security Transparency Advisory Group, which is an independent organization that provides advice to the Minister of Public Safety. And we published 3 reports between 2019 and 2022, one on the relationship between public safety agencies and the intelligence community, and that is relevant here when you take into account transparency. Transparency is, in general, a tool that is underutilized by in relationships with civil society. More transparency is better for national security. It is not an obstacle. And in the context of countering foreign interference, transparency must be key. Our first line of defense against interference is often societal resilience. The confidence of people's confidence toward institutions is essential, and transparency is essential to develop that trust and confidence. It is also essential to raise people's awareness, and that is civil society and the private sector, because everyone has a role to play when it comes to interference. A lack of transparency, which is a huge problem today, works against us when we try to protect ourselves from interference. In Canada, the situation with regard to transparency and national security is much better than 10 or 20 years ago, but we can do better. Well, let's talk about C-70 now. Part 1 on modernizing the CSIS Act. The first element that I'd like to discuss here is to allow CSIS to better communicate with actors outside of the federal government. The CSIS faces huge obstacles when it comes to the targets of foreign interference, which are generally outside of the federal government. More transparency is necessary for the exercise of those new potential powers. Within the advisory group on transparency, we heard testimony from a number of representatives of civil society, and there is a great deal of mistrust when it comes to CSIS. So bridges must be built. What does that mean? Transparency must be practiced in a broader way. There must be communication with new partners within civil society, which will arise through these new powers. Must be proactive. It must be sustained as well. It cannot be just reactive and passive. We must build ties of trust, and we must truly have a sharing of information. It can't just be symbolic. CSIS must also be transparent with Canadians and explain what was done after the fact and to show the results of CSIS's actions. So it's easy to say, and I understand that it is difficult to put into practice. It will take more resources, and CSIS does not have those resources right now. It will also take a change of culture, and because it will only work partially if there is no change in culture, because CSIS is still too insular, despite the progress that has been made. C70 would also give new powers to CSIS with regard to inquiries and the collection of data and to managing data. And transparency is key there too, because the relevant mechanisms for accountability and reporting must be transparent. So the report from CSIS must also contain as much information as possible on its use of its new powers. CSIS could also communicate proactively with Canadians and partners within civil society, with the media, and also with parliamentarians regarding the use of its new powers. So that is also essential to build people's trust and to ensure that the accountability mechanisms work well. Also, C70 will create the position of the Foreign Influence Transparency Commissioner. Here again, transparency is key because the procedures for registering must be simple and clear. They cannot be heavy and bureaucratic. The same goes for the mechanism for hearing complaints. One thing that the NSTAG, National Security Transparency Advisory Group, heard was that the mechanisms in place are not sufficiently accessible. There therefore must be a significant effort to educate the public with regard to what can be done. Once again, it's easier said than done. It takes the right people with the right skills and with the right powers to carry this out. And as in Ottawa, that isn't always close at hand. When it comes to the accountability mechanisms, they must work well and to improve societal resiliency, among other things. Finally, it will also be necessary to review the Act every 5 years in order to improve it and to adapt it. And ideally, that review process must have a transparent public aspect in order to reach all of the goals that I just mentioned with regard to societal resilience and to raising awareness. So there must be a binding review. So we know that with regard to the review of C59, that didn't happen, and that is a shame.
Thank you, Mr. Junot. And we now go to Mr. Stanton for an opening statement of up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon, committee members. I'm going to talk about the disclosure of intelligence, the new regime that's proposed in Bill C-70, as well as the criminalization of foreign intelligence. I'm going to echo in some ways Thomas Junot's remarks with respect to transparency, and I do confess we didn't have time to collaborate on this. It's purely coincidental. Section 19 of the CSIS Act, the proposal to amend that is going to amplify the range and scope of disclosures from currently where it is. And it is something I have some personal experience with as having been an intelligence officer in CSIS for 32 years, and I was seized with the disclosure regime. So the proposal, of course, under the rubric of building resiliency against threats is that the service may disclose intelligence to those outside the federal departments. And we're hearing about the private sector. We're hearing about universities, particularly in sensitive research. We're hearing about other levels of government, including Indigenous government bodies as well, and municipal government, law enforcement. So it's a wider orbit that's being proposed where intelligence will be shared in the interests of national security. This is going to be a significant overhaul, both in terms of the mandated CSIS and national security. And I do say this is way beyond foreign interference. This covers other programs that CSIS collects intelligence on. But the government is going to decide in some ways how this is going to be shared. Nobody's going to be opening taps and turning on spigots and declassifying information. And I think there's a lot of expectations in various sectors in Canada that that's actually going to be happening. We're still going to have the need-to-know principle. We're still going to have people who are security cleared to receive that intelligence. They're going to actually have to have a clearance. They're going to have background checks. We're going to have to ensure that that intelligence has the physical and IT protection to safeguard it. You can't have intelligence being provided to new partners and then a week later we're reading it on social media. So I'm enthusiastic about it. I think it's going to really enhance the government's, I guess you could say, more holistic view and assessment of threats. It gives CSIS a lot more leverage as well. And echoing my colleague's remarks, it makes more transparency, clearly, with government. The other aspect I wanted to make reference to is the criminalization of foreign intelligence, the measures to counter foreign intelligence. We're talking about Section 50. And we're talking about the Foreign Interference and Security Information Act for the amendment. I'm very enthusiastic about this. When I testified at a committee a year ago in March, one of the comments I made is that unlike terrorism and unlike espionage, there actually is no legislative hammer. There actually is no legal consequences of any significance with foreign interference enablers. That's changing with this new legislation. I'm very excited about it. So this will allow the government to basically prosecute whether it's transnational repression or whether it's interference in our democratic processes. I also find it interesting that in this bill there's an extraterritorial application going into this foreign interference and transnational repression. And this makes a lot of sense because CSIS mandate in security intelligence is not limited to Canada. CSIS works around the world. And so in many ways, this will complement their Section 2B activities in terms of intelligence collection on transnational repression, as well as the interference in the election, and that they can actually be prosecuted. I'm going to quote specifically. They're saying that if the person who commits an act referred to in subsection 1, this is 26.1, while outside Canada, is deemed to have committed it in Canada, if the victim is in Canada, or if the victim is abroad, let's say they're in India or they're in the People's Republic of China, that they can still be prosecuted in Canada. So there's no sanctuary for the fact that this activity or an aspect of this activity is taking place outside of Canada. So the legislation also calls for the same thing with consequences on influencing political government processes. Section 24 and subsection 1, every person who commits an indictable offense who at the direction of or in association with a foreign entity engages in surreptitious or deceptive conduct with the intent to influence a political or government process. Every person who commits an offense under subsection 1 is liable to imprisonment for life. This is serious. This is what you get with espionage, and this is what you get with terrorism. And I'm delighted to see this coming into the foreign interference file. The particular SOIA amendments will offer criminal sanctions against clandestine foreign interference designed to benefit a foreign state in actions against the Canadian state, its interests, or the exercise of democratic rights. This will open the way to laying foreign interference charges in Canada, something we have not seen, and I think we'd all agree are fairly relevant these days. Lastly, I just want to mention there's been some adjustments to CSIS authorities in Section 16. That's the non-threat-related foreign interference. I'm very enthused about that. I know it's giving CSIS a lot more, I guess you could say, of a holistic view in terms of the foreign intelligence mandate they have. I know the bill has its limitations, but I would like to see at some point the government basically scrap the Section 16 because it's an anachronistic classification we have from the Cold War, Section 12, Section 16, and I think this change signifies the fact that the government is recognizing that we don't need that within Canada collection on what is considered foreign intelligence.
Could you wrap up?
That's
please, sir?
it, and I thank you.
Thank you. We go now to Mr. Fung. Mr. Fung, please make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, Chair and committee member. As a professor and Canada Research Chair at McGill University, my work focuses on AI, cybersecurity, and social media analytics. I would like to express my concern of foreign interference in Canadian academic institutions. I would like to begin by sharing a personal experience. Over the past few years, a prominent Chinese 5G enterprise, which I will refer to as Company H, has repeatedly approached me with various research collaborations proposals. They offered me a consulting positions on their AI team with a salary that is 3 times of my earning as a professor. Despite rejecting their offers, they persistently contacted me every few years, and just last year they explicitly expressed interest in my work on malware analysis. Let me emphasize this again. This company is specifically interested in computer viruses. So clearly this raises national security concern. Another tactic they use is offering research contracts through external organizations owned by professors. This would bypass any university or government approval processes. I'm sure Company H is not the only foreign state-controlled organizations operating under the guise of a Canadian company. As a scientist, I really hope this bill can address this national security risk, and I urge our government to disclose a list of organizations or have some mechanism to allow university to query that which company are controlled or influenced by foreign governments in Canada and posing a national security risk. This transparency will help Canadian researchers avoid compromising collaborations. In 2024, the Canadian government released a list of named research organizations in 3 foreign countries. This is a commendable step towards safeguarding our scientific contributions. However, it is crucial to understand that research projects conducted in any Chinese university can be repurposed for military use. So the determining factor is not the collaborating organizations, but the potential application of the technology itself. Therefore, the assessment should be conducted at the country level with the sensitivity of the research topics. The second concern I have is that Chinese consulates in Canada maintain close ties with many Chinese student associations in Canadian universities, as seen in their co-organized events. For instance, the first event of Chinese student orientation is often a meeting with the Chinese consulate, rather than the university administrators or professors. This arrangement sends a clear message to the international Chinese student: be compliant. The big brother in China is watching you. This pressure can lead students to disclose information about their research, schoolmates, or professors to foreign governments. If this bill is passed, it is crucial for university administrations to inform international students of its provisions. This bill will empower students to confidently reject requests from foreign governments. I'm supportive of the bill with the following amendments. First, I suggest removing the administrative monetary penalty. Maybe I don't fully understand that part, but this punishment seems to be too weak. Second, currently the CCP government purchased airtime from the Chinese radio stations in Canada to broadcast their propaganda. I just wonder whether this Chinese media should be registered in Canada. Third, I support the idea of having 2-tier registrations like the UK model. This will allow the Canadian government to impose more accurate restrictions on selected entities. Fourth, with the advancement of AI technology, the foreign interference activities are expected to change rapidly. So a more frequent periodic review of this act may be needed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. We now go to Mr. Soleimani to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes. Please go ahead, sir.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. On January 8, 2020, I lost my wife, Elnaz, in the downing of flight PS752 by IRGC, the Iranian regime missiles. Before this meeting, I reached out to several active members of Iranian-Canadian community, and today I will share first-hand experiences concerning the Iranian regime threats on Canadian soil. 1. 3 months after the downing of flight PS752 in March 2020, Hassan Rezaeifar, the lead investigator of flight PS752 case in Iran, contacted me. During a long conversation, which I recorded, he invited me to meet in Iran or France, and later threatened me to remove an Instagram post criticizing the government of Iran. I refused, and shortly after, my family was contacted by Iran's security intelligence services. Notably, Rezaeifar was one of the main individuals responsible for bulldozing the crash site and destroying evidence. 2. The families of flight PS752 victims have endured immense pressure from the Iranian regime, including summonses, detentions, and physical torture. Some families have been banned from leaving Iran, and a judge in Iran has explicitly stated that the regime of Iran could target and remove those in Canada who oppose it. 3. The IRGC perpetuates terror and threat both within Iran and globally. Members of the Basij and IRGC branch freely study, work, and live here in Canada. Iranian Canadians across the country have been threatened by the regime agents and supporters to remain silent or face consequences. The contact between IRGC and the families of Iranian Canadians in Iran who have protested against the regime clearly shows that regime agents actively monitor and report on Iranian Canadians. There are reliable evidence that the Iranian regime has been actively promoting its agenda in Canada through various Islamic centers and groups, both at university and within communities across the country, which should be investigated. 5. Canadian officials have hesitated to list the IRGC as a terrorist organization and have explained that the significant investments are made by the regime of Iran and its members in Canada real estate and businesses, which could potentially lead to chaotic conditions if they designate IRGC as a terrorist organization. So we shouldn't be surprised that the former head of Tehran police, known for suppressing protests, stays freely in Canada. 5. In July 2021, following the disclosure that the Iranian regime planned to kidnap Masih Alinejad, a prominent Iranian-American activist, and 3 others in Canada, Canadian security services contacted some Iranian Canadians, including myself, to ensure our safety. This incident highlights that our security services were previously unaware of the threats on Canadian soils. 6. Canadian authorities have advised some active members of Iranian Canadian community to reduce their activities or maintain a low profile to avoid attracting attention. This advice raises serious concerns about public safety and national security in Canada. To conclude, the foreign interference of the Iranian regime in Canada is undeniable. Despite clear evidence of a threat to national security, there has been hesitation among Canadian officials to designate the IRGC as a terrorist organization. It is crucial for Canada to designate the IRGC as a terrorist organization in practice, not just symbolically with non-binding motions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. We will start our questions at this point. We go now to Mr. Caputo for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank our witnesses both here in person and on video for being here on both short notice and on such an important matter. I know it feels like I'm a really long way from our witnesses, but I'll try to direct my questions in as personable a way as possible. Before I begin, Mr. Soleimani, I hope I pronounced that correctly, My deepest condolences on your loss. I can't imagine what it's like to lose somebody so close to you, somebody you love, and then come here and talk about it when you haven't seen the requisite change. I hadn't planned on asking you this, but I'm going to ask anyways through you, Mr. Chair. I will ask him this. What impact do you think has occurred by virtue of the fact that we, as Canadian parliamentarians, despite multiple votes and the will of Parliament saying that the IRGC should be a terrorist entity and recognized as such, has not been recognized as a terrorist organization?
Thank you so much. As I mentioned earlier, designating IRGC with non-binding motion is not effective. That's why right now we can see top IRGC commanders in Canada. And we can see easily active members of BASIJ, an important branch of IRGC, come to Canada, study, work, live, and also identifying and reporting Iranian Canadians to the regime of Iran. Clearly, what we have done so far couldn't stop IRGC operation in Canada. And I don't understand why Canadian officials do not list the IRGC as a terrorist organization. Definitely, there are some concerns for not affecting innocent people that had military services, compulsory military services in Iran, but I think it's not rocket science. There are some legal ways to figure it out and listing IRGC as a terrorist organization without affecting innocent people.
For that. Now, to Mr. Stanton, perhaps Mr. Juneau can chime in. Professor Fung talked about what I would call an insidious kind of mechanism of interference, right? As in somebody who's on a university campus, or I taught at a university in 3 different faculties, and this isn't something I had ever seen, right? But from what what Professor Fung is saying, this is happening fairly frequently. Is that something that you've experienced, sir, as somebody who worked at such a high level with CSIS and for some time?
Well, the question would be, would the individual on the campus be considered a threat to national security? They would have to meet, that criteria, Section 2, where the service would already be investigating them. So I guess if something came up, let's say that, say Mr. Fung had raised, and then the service does some inquiries and they're able to link it in any way to, in this case, a foreign state, they would be investigating it. They would focus on the threat. There'd have to be an individual that they would investigate. And the fact that they're at a university, it's a sensitive institution, but sensitive institutions in Canada are not sanctuaries in any ways for threats, so it still would be pursued regardless of what sector or where they are.
Professor Juneau, do you have anything to add to that? No? Okay, thank you. How much time do I have, please, Chair?
1:50.
1:50? Okay, thank you. I've asked this question before, and I hear a range of answers, but one of the questions is about the commissioner that would be appointed under this act with respect to foreign influence and transparency. And that commissioner would presumably be working, obviously, at arm's length from the government, but may be a part of the government as opposed to being fully independent. In this case, the commissioner would be appointed through an order in council, and I believe that there would be consultations with the House of Commons and the Senate, but not approval required through the House and the Senate. Do you have any comments on that and the independence of the potential commissioner that we're debating in this legislation? Either or.
If I can jump in quickly on that. I think it is absolutely essential that the commissioner be fully independent and be perceived as fully independent, given the sensitivity of the issue, given the very negative consequences of perceptions of a lack of independence. And even if it's only even if it's an inaccurate perception of a lack of independence, if it's still a dominant perception, that would be very damaging to the work of that commissioner, which will be so reliant on trust and a perception of independence. I would add that in terms of the nomination of that individual, consultations will be essential, but public consultations, or that there be some public and transparent element to these consultations, again, so that there's an element of consensus and legitimacy around that individual.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
We go now to Mr. Dollarwall. Mr. Dollarwall, please go ahead, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I want to thank the witnesses for appearing today on this very important matter. Mr. Chair, my questions will be to Mr. Stanton. Mr. Stanton, following the tragic killing of Mr. Hardeep Singh Nijjar, a Canadian on Canadian soil, my constituent, and at a place of worship in my riding of Surrey Newton, I introduced a private member's motion M112 for government to take action to deal with the foreign interference, whether it's intimidation, violence, or interference that they create. And they brought in, following that, they brought in Bill C-70, right, to combat foreign interference. And it is clear that there have been and likely currently are agents in Canada working on behalf of foreign states in order to undermine our sovereignty and our democratic institutions. Do you believe that the amendments to Criminal Code and Security Information Act will sufficiently address concerns related to transnational threats and violence to Canadians? If not, what else can be done?
I would say certainly yes, it does address it. But when I look at the tragedy, what happened with Mr. Nijjar, I see that more as state assassination, state murder. I mean, I'll be blunt with it. We can call it transnational repression, but I mean, foreign interference is used pretty broadly. A lot of Canadians, when you say foreign interference, all sorts of things come into mind. And in this case, we're looking at a considerable shift in the operations of a foreign intelligence service, a hostile foreign intelligence service, and sovereignty issues with Canada, and of course the murder of a Canadian. So I can't say that the provisions that are going to come in with the legislation would certainly have prevented that, but I would say it would probably mitigate the transnational threat environment, which was allowed to grow and develop and sophisticate and make something like that conducive to that they did. So it's sort of a half answer. I think it's good. I don't think it certainly would have prevented the tragedy that happened to him.
And it's my understanding that agents of the foreign governments may operate through chain of command. It may be very difficult to trace that chain of command to individuals abroad. Bill C-70 do enough to address or deter foreign interference and penalize those that are not in Canada or overseas? Or would we do something to do that?
It could, but I would say a perfect world, they would be subject to a law enforcement investigation and a prosecution in the courts. I mean, if those foreign agents or intermediaries were in any way tied to this through evidence, I would rather see that sanctioned through our due process and a good prosecution. I don't have enough understanding of the SOIA legislation to see where that would be penalized. Maybe it could for someone who's not involved in the actual dirty work of it. Maybe some facilitation. Yes, they are abroad. That could be tied into it. But I would hope if there's going to be any justice in this case, it would be within our courts and with our criminal code.
Mr. June, you want to add anything? No? Okay. Mr. Stanton, under the proposed legislation framework, those who undertake activities to influence government or political process in Canada would be required to register publicly. What type of penalties or consequences should be imposed on those who may deliberately or knowingly not register?
Well, I don't have a background on the registry. To be frank, I've in the past spoken that I don't see it as being a great mitigator in foreign interference. I have to be candid on that. I think it will be helpful in terms of buttressing the Lobbying Act and a few things like that. But the more egregious acts of foreign interference, and certainly the interference in our democratic processes, are clandestine. And so the foreign agent registry provisions are to get people to identify as having agency with a foreign entity. But they're not the clandestine actors. They're not the ones that are either repressing in our diaspora community, tormenting people, harassing them, or meddling, interfering in our elections. So again, not an authority on the registry, but I wouldn't look to that for any, I guess you could say, threat reduction in the interference realm in our democracy.
Legislation proposed to enhance capability of CSIS to collect and utilize data sets. Protecting privacy and personal information will be very important. Could you please give your thoughts on the steps taken to ensure that the data is properly used and protected?
I have to say humbly, I have absolutely no background on that. I'm mostly a human guy, human source guy. I really don't have any expertise on data sets or the, I guess, privacy implications.
In your opinion, do you believe that Bill C-70 does enough to ensure that the diaspora communities are not stigmatized and victimized by the efforts to combat foreign interference?
Well, I think that's the hope. I think one of the things that's kind of saddened me a bit in the last few years with all the talk on foreign interference and things we've had through committees and media and things like that, is that some Canadians are going to start, profiling communities and things like that, which is wrong. It's fundamentally wrong, and I think that's why. The more education we have, the more we're talking about it, and more things like this initiative C-71, the reviews we've had close to, I think, 5 now, commissions, inquiries related to national security, where Canadians are actually learning more about it. I think we're less likely to see stereotyping and profiling. But that has always been my concern. That's part of the reason I speak out publicly on this, is I don't want Canadians to think that that particular group, that community, is in any way any of questionable loyalty or reliability because of what we're hearing through the media.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dhaliwal. On y va maintenant, Monsieur Villemure.
Mr. Villemure, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses who are here with us today, here in person and virtually. Mr. Junot, I heard your speech on transparency, and you advocate for transparency, and you're talking about the trust of things that we cannot always control. But when it comes to the registry, what do you think of the idea of having a dual registration of the agency and the person who is the object of the transaction? So there would be 2 registrations, if you will, because that would make it possible for us to identify those involved. So do you think that that would be positive for transparency? That's a good question. And I must admit that I do not understand the issue well with regard to what you've raised. I would need to have more details on how the registry would work. I know that you did ask that question last week to people in this committee. And on the public safety side, the answer dealt with the burden that would represent. So really, I do not understand that specific issue well enough, but I must say that I do generally sympathize with the answer provided by the public safety people, because the Public Safety Department and CSIS and other departments or agencies in the public safety community really are direly lacking in financial and human resources. With regard to their powers, the bill will improve that somewhat, but any new initiative like C-70 or what you just brought up with regard to a dual registration would represent an additional burden. So I think that generally speaking, I would say that it's very important for the committee to consider additional resources. The idea of a double registration, so if you look at the lobbying registry, there's the idea of having a more direct report. But when it comes to the organizational and financial burden, I heard that answer. But then I was thinking that if we look at the report that was produced yesterday, it was that, in fact, we can't afford not to. Because, really, if we must deal with foreign interference, well, the financial burden cannot be the only criteria at play when making decisions. Yes, I agree. It can't be the only criteria, but we have to deal with reality as well. The lack of financial resources is a limitation. And when it comes to the opinions that are expressed in the media and elsewhere, well, that real constraint is too often ignored. Yes, it is real. I agree. So I'd like to continue asking questions on this. I liked Mr. Stanton's comment with regard to the clandestine operatives are obviously not registered anywhere. That is true. But when it comes to the 3-year period of preventing, for example, cabinet members from working for a foreign entity for 3 years after their mandate, because that would prevent them from using information that they would have been the sole people to have access to. So yes, I think that a delay period after leaving their position within the government is not only recommended but necessary. There's a parallel here with regard to the point raised after your colleague's question. There is this issue of the perception of people's trust that is linked to perception. There must be a buffer period after someone leaves office, because that's a fundamental principle to ensure trust. So when you talk about trust and perceived and real transparency, yes, we've seen the provisions in the bill, but really that's reality. But if the perception is not there on the part of people, well, then that is a problem. So yes, the Commissioner for Foreign Influence Transparency must have true independence and perceived independence. I think that the appointment of that commissioner is problematic at the moment, but let me talk about something else now. You talked about the review every 5 years. So we know that we have a number of acts that have not been reviewed according to their own provisions. And it's not just this government. A number of governments don't tend to go back and review the bills. And that is a problem. Because, I mean, when you come to the protection of private information, for example, when you want to ensure that this review takes place, what can we do to, in fact, ensure it? So when it comes to an annual report by the Commissioner, there must be one, because if there isn't one, then that is a big problem. That is independent from the issue of a review every 5 years. But the Commissioner must produce a report every year that will be presented to Parliament and that will show all of the activities conducted by the Commissioner. When it comes to the 5-year review of the bill, that's essential. A C-59 was adopted. It created SECU. I can never remember the acronym in French. But that bill also foresaw a review every 5 years. It was supposed to happen in 2022, and it didn't happen, and that, to me, is a problem. When the committee was created, the world was different than it is today, and the world will continue to change. So it's important to continue to adapt, to reform, maybe make minor changes, but really it's important to ensure that the powers that have been attributed are still the right powers. And it's also the public aspect that has to come into play to show a society, civil society, to show parliamentarians that there's an ongoing thought process that brings about change. Because when that doesn't happen, it's a very significant missed opportunity. Thank you.
Mr. McGregor. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I appreciate all of the witnesses being here today, so thank you very much for your testimony thus far. Mr. Standen, I'd like to start with you. I'm glad that you clarified for the committee a little bit more about the CSIS disclosure process. You know, there's still some very important safeguards in there requiring security clearance, the safety of the information transmitted, and so on. But just to very briefly, so when I'm looking at this section and who, could you just walk me through the process within CSIS? Would this be a director-level decision on making a disclosure ruling?
That's an interesting question. Let me start with how it begins. For example, when I was a field officer in the region, I worked in 3 regions, I would want to talk to someone. Let's say they had an interesting contact with someone. So I would make a disclosure. I would say what organization I'm with. And I'm Dan. And then at some point during an interview, without saying too much, they're going to know I'm interested in, Mr. Bloggin. So in order to carry out their mandate, CSIS themselves in various capacities can make disclosures. In many ways, it's to carry out the mandate. It could be a bit of a, getting confidence, or at some point getting support, and maybe even eventually having a source relationship. And they can do that. So, but the day-to-day stuff that's reported to government, it's going to government readers, and it wouldn't be a high-up sign-off, really. It would be just a regular process, as we've seen with these inquiries, where there's all sorts of intelligence products going to various government departments, assessment, raw material, and it wouldn't be much higher than a middle manager decision.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, where it gets really dicey is when you get into things like intelligence being provided to law enforcement. And that's where people start getting nervous, and that's where you're going to have you're going to have a director general input into it. Or even something more sensitive, it's obviously going to be bounced up to the executive level. So there are protocols in place.
Thank you. And also during your opening statement, you made mention of the term transnational repression, which is what we heard from our witnesses yesterday, representing Uyghurs and, of course, Tibetans. They were urging the committee to include a definition of transnational repression. And in my opinion, we're probably looking at the SOIA section of the bill, given that, we already have amendments here that's dealing with intimidation, threats, or violence, numerous sections that are really going after, the clandestine foreign operations in our country dealing with foreign interference. Do you have sort of a thoughts on a definition of transnational repression, or do you think the way the SOIA amendments are written currently kind of addresses that in its entirety?
I think it addresses it. I have to say, first of all, I don't have a legal background, so I'm looking at it in terms of from a threat perspective, and most of my career was in counterintelligence. So CSIS has their definitions, for example, from the CSIS Act. So in this case, it would fall under Section 2B. What we call transnational repression is foreign interference, where it's actually targeting the emigre communities and manipulating and threatening and potentially killing. And so I don't know if an actual definition is it's certainly not going to give CSIS any more authorities that they don't need. And I don't think in terms of indictable offenses and the criminalization of transnational repression, it's really going to make a difference. Then again, I'm not a lawyer.
Yeah, because as I was following with their testimony, everything they thought should be included in the definition of transnational repression seemed to already be included in this bill, just in different sections. So I appreciate your thoughts on that. Professor Juneau, I'd like to start with you, and I'm just going to reference Part 4 of the bill that is setting up the new commissioner. There have been a few different opinions about this bill being country agnostic. Other private members' bills have opted for a scheduled list because, of course, some countries certainly are worse off, in our opinion, than others, given what they're trying to do here on Canadian soil. Do you have any thoughts about this bill being country agnostic and just leaving it open to any country that might have to register in this?
I find that there are good arguments on both sides, so I wouldn't say, and I'm not avoiding the question, but I wouldn't say that there's one really good and one really bad option in country agnostic or not. I would tend to very cautiously lean on being against the country agnostic approach, but barely, if only for what we were discussing in the previous one of the previous questions, which is the issue of workload. The reality is that the community as a whole is overstretched. It's hollowed out. Threats are proliferating. We all know that. So would it simplify, streamline a bit by having a list of countries that pose a threat at this level? I think the answer might be yes to that. So that might be a good argument. Building that list would obviously be controversial. There would be disagreements, but I still think that could be doable. I mean, government does complicated things all the time, and establishing a list of countries that pose a foreign interference threat is something that I think we should be able to do and adopt, even if it means changing it every 6 months or every year as situations change.
I just mentioned that because, like, right now, of course, we have a very complicated relationship with India, and sometimes there can be trade interests versus national security interests, and I'm just wondering about that. Yeah.
In a way, having a country-agnostic list is a way of avoiding that debate, right?
Thank you for that.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. So we'll start our second round. We will end this round with Mr. McGregor down the way. We'll go now to Mr. Jennis for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. This is a really strong panel with people with diverse experience, so I'm sorry to those I don't get to with questions. So many interesting things and important things were said. Mr. Soleimani, thank you for highlighting the need to list the IRGC as a terrorist organization, to use our existing laws to combat foreign interference. And I completely agree with you as the proposer of two of those non-binding motions in Parliament. Non-binding motions are not enough. We want to see executive action listing the IRGC as a terrorist organization. As opposition members, we use the tools we have to try to highlight the issue, of course, but the goal of that is to push the government to act. The government has sadly voted, while voting in favor of both of those motions, they have sadly still not acted. Conservatives have also tabled Bill C-350, which would list the IRGC as a terrorist organization. We've tried to expedite that bill, and Liberals have blocked those efforts. Mr. Soleimani, I was particularly struck by something you revealed in your testimony, that law enforcement in Canada, if I heard right, that law enforcement in Canada are asking activists in the Iranian community to keep a low profile, essentially encouraging them not to speak out about important issues, not to be doing their important work of highlighting human rights issues in Iran for fear of their safety here in Canada. Could you clarify if I understood that right, and speak to who is delivering these messages and who is receiving them?
So thank you so much, Garnet. So it was my personal experience and some other active member of Iranian Canadian communities. It was in the middle of Women Life Freedom Revolution that I was contacted by a person from security services, and he clearly mentioned to me maybe the best way to avoid attraction from the Iranian regime be low profile. So where is the freedom of speech? Here in Canada, we should be afraid of the Iranian regime. This is exactly what the Iranian regime wants. Many Iranian Canadians do not feel safe in Canada. Why? Because agents and supporters of the Iranian regime are here, and obviously they identify and report active member of Iranian Canadians community to Iranian regime, and then Iranian regime contact their families inside Iran. So it's so clear that the Iranian regime agents are here among us, and it's a national security threat. We don't feel safe.
Yeah, absolutely. But moreover, of course, people don't feel safe if the message that they're getting from law enforcement, instead of exercise your rights and we'll have your back, is don't exercise your rights, be quiet, and that's the only way you'll be protected. That is shocking and horrifying to me. If If I was told as a member of Parliament by security services that I should be quiet about certain issues and keep a low profile for my own safety, that would clearly be unacceptable. And members of the public, citizens, activists, regardless of their background, must be free to exercise their charter guaranteed rights and know that they will be protected in doing so. Could you clarify specifically which security agency has delivered that message?
CSIS.
Okay. Okay, that's very troubling, and I think that's something we'll need to follow up on. Very quickly for Mr. Fung, I think you had mentioned in your opening statement media outlets that are here that are foreign state controlled. There's a private member's bill C-281 from my colleague Philip Lawrence that would seek to limit the ability of foreign state-controlled media to get broadcasting licenses in certain kinds of situations where those are hostile authoritarian states. What would your view be on such provisions? Should we consider restricting broadcasting licenses from entities that are controlled by hostile foreign states?
Yes, definitely, we should control that. And currently, basically, the Chinese government is buying the airtime from some popular Chinese radio stations in Vancouver and Toronto areas to broadcast their propaganda. So, and of course, another channel that we should consider is the social media, right? Like the WeChat, TikTok, those are even more, creating more problem in terms of propaganda from foreign governments.
Thank you, Mr. Janice. We go now to Mr. Gahir. Mr. Gahir, 5 minutes, please.
Great. Thank you, Chair, and I'm very appreciative of the witnesses for appearing before the committee. Mr. Stanton, my questions are largely for you, and they're actually along the lines of what Mr. McGregor was asking about. I wanted to talk about disclosure and how it currently works at CSIS. You mentioned a range of disclosure in your opening testimony. So if there is pertinent information, let's say regarding foreign interference, who can that information be shared with? Is there a limitation on who it can be shared with? And who decides whether that disclosure should be made or not?
Depends what the purpose is. I mean, you know, CSIS is collecting intelligence all the time. That's their mandate, is to collect, report to government, and provide advice, and then do some other activities. And so they're not, you know, they're not hardwired in a way to, we have to always disclose, or we need to. Now, obviously, if it's threat related, and certainly if it's going to be a physical threat or anything like that, they will do everything they can to make sure that's disclosed, either directly from them or maybe it'll be through law enforcement on something like that, something where it's a physical threat, or we call it life or limb. Now, if it's something where, you know, the issue came up earlier in some House committees about members of Parliament, for example, and things like that, obviously they're looking at a better way of giving CSIS that authority to make the disclosure. And that's the point. That's the reason I raised Section 19 amendments. The reason CSIS hasn't been making those disclosures, it's not because they lack imagination or they're obsessed with secrecy. It's because it's the law. They're actually prohibited from disclosing outside that. If it's intelligence, you are in non-compliance and all sorts of things like that. So they're disclosures that will be made as part of carrying through an investigation, for example. That might a bit information is given to get in an interview and things like that. But this will be new. This will be new for the service. This will be new territory where they're going to have to come up with strategic reasons that are in the interests of Canada, basically the public interest, to make these disclosures of intelligence.
I guess one of the fears that I have is that perhaps CSIS has a few pieces of that puzzle, and perhaps other law agencies also have a few pieces of that puzzle, but it's only when you combine all of that information do you see a full picture or enough of the picture that, you know, that it can be raised to a certain level where perhaps charges are laid or perhaps an investigation is launched. Do you think that the bill will change this regime so that more information is shared?
Provided to those traditional non-partners. But let's forget there's any changes coming. there's constant cooperation and sharing going on with various entities. You don't have to have a disclosure regime if they're meeting with the municipal police force or provincial police force or whatever. There's information shared and assessed. They don't have to have a framework and authorities necessarily to pass it on. We're talking about here is where they're going to not that typical orbit of partners, we'll say, and those that aren't part of that normal, I guess you could sort of say, group of sharing where you can actually give them intelligence and you give them something, for example, in the universities. But in terms of where you're talking about a threat, and let's say in a community, CSIS would be liaising with everybody, all I guess you could say levels of government or entities that might have I guess you could say an equity in these investigations.
This was raised in earlier testimony as well, but would there ever be a situation where CSIS could share information with a foreign entity, perhaps a consulate or an embassy?
Well, they have arrangements with hundreds of foreign agencies, security intelligence agencies, police agencies internationally, in various scopes and ranges of cooperation. So there's a lot of sharing going on. And of course, there's a lot of care from a human rights perspective with what's sharing. So yeah, they share with many international partners, and whatever venue or means, it's whatever's, I guess you could say, secure and convenient.
So could you talk a little bit about what checks and balances are in place so that the information, like the wrong information, is not shared with a foreign actor that could be used against a Canadian or perhaps their families overseas? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, CSIS exercises a lot of, I guess you could say, due diligence in terms of information they're going to pass to a foreign agency that has, for example, a terrible human rights record. And there's a lot of them over there, overseas. So they, in many cases, won't pass anything where that person could be subject to, all sorts of things. And the same in receiving information. They're very skeptical whether that information came from coercion, financial incentives, all sorts of things. And it depends on, the relationship and the reliability of that foreign agency. So they're very careful in any information that's going to go over into intelligence channels in another state, and the implications, it's beyond their control how it's going to be handled. Great, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Guihir. C'est maintenant Monsieur Villemur, 2 minutes.
Now, Mr. Villemur, you have 2 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Stanton, with C-70, do you think that the situation that took place in the Winnipeg lab could have been prevented, or would it have happened anyway?
I don't think so, because my take on that, just what I've read, and it's no different than anyone in the public, is that there were, very shoddy security practices, to say the least. And that was conducive to somebody possibly committing economic espionage or possibly taking advantage of it. And so I think the pressure there is more on that department's internal security and physical security practices to signal there's a problem here. And then CSIS coming in, as you know, in the security clearance assessment. So it wasn't like they came in on some big investigation. They're just doing a clearance assessment, and they discover all this is there. So I think that's a breakdown probably outside of the CSIS mandate in a way, and more of I guess, a government problem.
Monsieur Junot, j'avais une question pour vous parce que.
Mr. Junot, I had a question for you because we talked about transparency, and I talked about the report from SECU yesterday. And so people were saying, well, give the members of parliament's names, and we can't do that because we have to protect personal information. But when it comes to the necessary secrecy for that committee's work and the requirement for transparency, how can we reconcile the two? Because they seem paradoxical. That is an excellent question. And that is the question that arises in all contexts where we talk about public safety and intelligence services, not just in the context of that parliamentary committee. There are a number of elements that come into play. And yes, it is necessary to respect the levels of classification and the classified nature of information. But I think that there is information that can be made public that is not made public. by the general community for a number of reasons. There's the culture of secrecy, and also there's making information classified that should not necessarily be classified. That's something that is a trend in the Canadian government and elsewhere. Other governments were not unique in that way. There's also an aversion to risk that is part of the culture, and I'm simplifying massively, but really it's a reaction to the fact that if you are too careful, well, then you don't get bitten. But if you're not careful enough, then the consequences are huge. So really, it's one thing to tell people at CSIS or at the RCMP, be transparent, but what does it mean in reality? What does, can I say this? Can I not say this? Will my superiors protect me or not? Because often the resistance takes place in the political sphere, not in the bureaucratic sphere, and not for security reasons, but to avoid the political embarrassment that releasing classified information would entail. So really, yes, protecting public safety and national security is essential, and it's at the heart of any discussion of transparency, and you have to look at what the authorities are for that. Thank you.
And with Mr. McGregor, 2 minutes and a half, please.
Thank you, Chair. Very briefly, Professor Juneau, I just wanted to talk about Part 4 and the definition of arrangement in the new act that's going to be enacted. It's talking about, whether you undertake some of these things under the direction of or in association with a foreign principal. Some people have raised concerns about association. Do you have any concerns about that? You've brought the theme of transparency. Do you think we need to further clarify this?
With apologies, that gets into a level of technical detail that is beyond my expertise.
Okay, understood. Okay, well, I'd like to take the moment just to thank all of our witnesses for helping guide us through this study. Mr. Chair, I have to just move a motion just for some housekeeping for committee business. This was a motion that I gave notice of last Friday on May 31st, and I'll just read it out. That in relation to its study of Bill S210, an act to restrict young persons' online access to sexually explicit material.
Mr. Caputo. Sorry, who's Mr. Caputo on a point of order? Excuse me.
Yes, I believe that we're operating under a House order which would supersede any other motion. I'm just wondering if the clerk can provide input on that, please.
I don't believe this would be out of order, but I'll ask the clerk. Is there any prohibition to this? Yeah. So Mr. McGregor has the floor. He's entitled to move his motion.
Thank you for checking that.
And the motion, we got notice of it some time ago, so it is in
Sorry,
order.
Chair, can I speak to the same point of order?
I'm sorry, on point of order?
Yes, Chair, I would have to disagree. If you look at the actual order from the House, that this committee is to be seized with no other committee business until this matter is done. The fact that the motion's on the table and has been already presented to the committee doesn't matter. We can't be talking about that until we're done this particular issue. And that's the point that Mr. Caputo was trying to make, and I'll be making again, is that's the position we're at. And so we have to honor the direction we got from the House, that our time should not be taken up with anything but this.
So that the House order does not preclude us from dealing with other matters. It asks us to deal with this in a concentrated manner. I forget the exact wording. Was there someone else on this point of order? Mr. Villemure, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. McGregor used his speaking time to table his motion, so I propose that he be allowed to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Now that we've dealt with that, I'd like to resume.
Just briefly, sir. So I believe this brings our questions to an end. So I would like to thank the witnesses for their presence and their contribution to this meeting and to our study, and would invite them to leave if that's their wish to do so. Thank you very much. Mr. McGregor, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. So I'll read into the record officially that in relation to its study of Bill S210, an act to restrict young persons' online access to sexually explicit material, and pursuant to Standing Order 97.1 Sub 1, the committee requests the approval of the House for a 30 sitting day extension in order to properly and adequately study the bill, hear from witnesses, and conduct clause-by-clause consideration of the bill with amendments before it is otherwise deemed reported back to the House without amendment on June 7th, 2024. I'll be very brief here, Mr. Chair. This is a simple housekeeping motion. If we do not, if we get to June 7th, this bill is going to be deemed reported back to the House. I think it would be a dereliction of duty for us to not study the bill and hear from additional witnesses. I'm not going to speak any further on this motion. I have canvassed the room. I believe there is a majority of this committee that's willing to vote and vote in the affirmative of this motion. So I'd appreciate it if we could keep our remarks to a minimum and arrive at a quick vote so that we can then proceed with the business of Bill C-70 for the remainder of the week. Thank you.
Sorry, I was getting advice. Not that I'm always going to take my advice, but I do get it. So, I'm sorry, Mr. McGregor, you finished your point. Mr. Caputo, floor is yours.
Consistent with what Mr. McGregor just said, I would move that we adjourn debate at this time.
A motion to adjourn debate has been made. Do we have, I guess we'll take a recorded vote. Do we have on division? No, I want a recorded vote. Okay, yes, on a recorded vote. Mr. Clerk, if you would please.
On the question to adjourn debate, Mr. Biddle.
Yes.
Mr. MacDonald. Mr. Gaillard. Yes. Mr. Dhaliwal. Yes. Mr. Callaway.
Yes.
Mr. Caputo.
Yes.
Mr. Shipley.
Yes.
Mr. Genius. Mr. Matz. Mr. Villemur.
No.
Monsieur McGregor.
No.
2 against.
Thank you. So the debate is adjourned. And so that wraps up our business for today. I'd like to let the committee know that notices will be going out for tomorrow. Looks like at this point, 2 panels. At this point, the notice will show two individuals in the second panel, but that's expected to change as we get confirmation, over the next little while. It'll be at right after question period. So right after the votes. It'll be right after the votes. 4:30? Yeah, about.
Remember, Simon, that the votes, there's supposed to be 8 or 9 of them. That's 2 hours. So
Well,
we should probably plan so we don't have a resource issue. So from like 5 to 7 or something like that, as opposed to 4:30, and then we have to get permission to extend.
We've got all the resources we need.
For tomorrow.
Yeah. And then on Thursday, the current expectation is 3 panels at this point. So we'll start at our regular time, 8:15, and 3 panels. And those panels are still being shaken down as we speak as well. So, shaken down by foreign actors. Well, there you go. No foreign actors here. So anyway, thank you all. We are now adjourned.